In preparation for Season 8, I wanted to jump back into basics and talk about some of the mythology and folklore, and to a lesser extent, urban legends that have inspired me as a writer. As a kid growing up, these were the content areas that I most enjoyed in school. The reason is because they lean into the fantastical, in some instances, the supernatural. It is with that in mind that I will be focusing this season's Creators Corner content on this very topic. Each month, I'll be discussing 2 or 3 influences, and since it's October, I decided to turn into the skid and focus on something spooky. This month, we're going to be talking about the villain of Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, as well as the Algonquin myth of the Wendigo. I was a kid when I first got introduced to The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Of course, I didn't get introduced to it through the book, but through the Disney animated short film narrated by Bing Crosby. I loved this animated film because of how much of a risk Disney took with bringing it to life. It was spooky. It was scary. And it was legitimately one of the things that had me scared of covered bridges for several years until I was at least in my teens. That and watching Beetlejuice as a 7-year-old kind of set the tone for me that covered bridges were just not safe. So aside from the maniacally laughing Disney animated version, I was exposed to 2 other versions of this character. The first version I encountered was in my teens, and that was the live-action version played by Christopher Walken in the 1998 Tim Burton film Sleepy Hollow. This version took historical elements, mainly German Hessian soldiers, fighting alongside the British during the American Revolution. Walken plays one such soldier with an unquenchable bloodlust, who ended up losing his head and was summoned back into service by a witch. Obviously, the film takes some liberties from the Washington Irving tale. The story never actually describes why the Headless Horseman is doing what he does. A bit about him being a Hessian is a legitimate basis, though, in the story. The third version that I came across in my 30s was from the Fox television program Sleepy Hollow, which follows Ichabod Crane as a soldier fighting against the British in the American Revolution, who was somehow brought back to life in the 21st century and is dealing with the repercussions of some of the things he encountered out on the battlefield, including, but not limited to, the Headless Horseman coming back. I think it's a series that should have run for 1 season and culminated with the destruction of the Headless Horseman. The story would have been a lot stronger, but they went on for 3 more seasons and felt like a weird blend of Sherlock meets Supernatural meets Charmed. There's a lot of Creature of the Week episodes to pad the runtime of each season, and most of the stuff involving the Headless Horseman is relatively short-lived and contained mostly to season 1. But I've recently learned that the Headless Horseman is actually based on a creature from Irish folklore called a Dullahan. A headless rider on a black steed, or a coachman carrying his own head? Check. The creature's name comes from Irish Gaelic, meaning fierce or angry. It's a malicious entity and will do harm to travelers on the road. In some versions, the rider wields a flaming whip. Now, you can adapt it how you'd like, but what I did was I created a character in my 4th book, Hadron Corvus of Farfell, called Moet. This was a character who was consumed by rage and malicious intent for the protagonist and is allowed to be consumed by a set of demons using him as a sort of executioner. While the character is not headless, his face does turn into a skull, and he wears black robes and a hood and wields a flaming sword. Since I used Hebrew pronunciations and words for the basis of the Farfellian language, the character's name is taken from the word Maveth, or in biblical Hebrew, Moth. Both words mean death. Now let's turn our attention to the Wendigo. I had a passing recognition of the creature in my youth from reading Marvel Comics. The Wendigo was a frequent minor antagonist of Wolverine. But it wasn't until I was 19 and living in Japan when I caught the first season of Charmed, and one of the episodes featured a Wendigo. In this version, the creature is more like a werewolf that can change from human to beast during the phases of the full moon, and became a monster because she had a frozen heart. They're typically women, apparently, in this version. The true folklore is way more frightening. The Algonquins told this story for generations as a lesson against cannibalism, especially during the harshest of winters when food is scarce. And the legend goes that it that to consume human flesh, especially to survive starvation, opens a pathway for the Wendigo spirit to inhabit a person and they become a Wendigo. The description of a Wendigo was a lanky, emaciated figure, not some hairy lycanthrope. Oh God, no, anything but that. In more modern adaptations, the creature takes on a lanky skeletal visage, but the face looks like a deer skull with antlers and sharp wolf-like fangs, which actually pop out in that Sleepy Hollow TV series that I mentioned earlier. The most accurate depiction I've seen is in the first season of Supernatural on the CW, which sticks to that lanky, emaciated figure. In the original drafts of my first book, I had a character named Gwendolyn who becomes infected and turned into a Wendigo in line with what I saw in that episode of Charmed. I later scrapped the character because I had a bloated cast and I needed to streamline my story when I revamped it. But I brought the character back for book 5, The Mantle of the Fatherless. Her name is Gavenna, and she was part of a tribe called the Kilha-Nashpa, an offshoot of elves who lived as skinwalkers, often taking on the appearance of direwolves through magic. Now, because of an event at the end of book 4, she comes into possession of a medallion containing a demon spirit that helps her be a healer, but also manifests intense hunger. Eventually, she transforms into a monster through a perversion of her people's magical abilities, and she rampages through the Arctic wilderness that she calls home. The creature in this story is called Venic, and it's an epithet that her people use to refer to anyone who engages in cannibalism. So here are 3 tips for adapting either of these folklore entities. First, do your research. Obviously, back in the late 90s and early 2000s, the producers of Charmed really played off of superficial understandings of the folklore. Do one better and research the origins of why the stories are told. The Dullahan represents danger while traveling on the road at night, especially if you pass by a graveyard. The Wendigo is a cautionary tale about the dangers of cannibalism. Second, you don't have to look for an original way to use the stories for your own writing. If you want to write a story of someone camping in the woods and facing starvation, turn into the skid and incorporate the folklore, even if it's a modern setting. A great example of this is the 2021 horror movie Antlers, starring Kerry Russell. Third, have fun with writing the story. If you can creep yourself out by what you're writing, then you're probably on the right track.